Hello and welcome to Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business. Joining me today is Daniel Tisch, who is CEO of Argyle. Thanks for joining us today, Daniel.
My pleasure, Mario. Good to see you today.
Well, we're going to talk a little bit about some survey results that were just released regarding employees and the relationship with employers. And one of the interesting aspects of this survey was that 77% of Canadians agreed that their employer has managed through COVID quite well. Just your thoughts, first of all, on that, Daniel. Did that surprise you? Is it a high number? Is it a low number? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, no, it did surprise me, Mario. I mean, because like obviously we've been through a year of unprecedented and really continuing disruption to workplaces everywhere, right? And we did the survey across North America with Leger. We call it the Argyle Public Relationships Index, and for I guess 6 years now, we've been looking at the relationships between organizations and their key publics. And so last year and this year specifically, we looked at that employer-employee relationship and how COVID was affecting it. And so this year we asked a specific question about, well, how do you feel about how your employer has managed it? And, it's really quite encouraging, I think, just as a society to see that employees give their employers really strong marks for the way they've managed the pandemic. So, I mean, 77% of Canadians agree that my employer has managed the COVID crisis well. Only 19% disagree. Right. And so that clearly suggests employers have been doing something right.
Yet, I noticed in the stats that 83% of Americans felt that way, so a little higher than Canada. Any thoughts of why that would be?
Well, the research tells us, we try to understand that from the research. And the best thing I can say, in terms of what the numbers tell us is, Americans tend to admire their companies more, at least they do right now, right? Because if you look at some of the other questions, they're more likely to believe their employer has strong relationships with customers in the community. They're more likely to believe the organization lives up to its purpose. You even ask people, do you think that this company is showing social leadership and environmental leadership? Americans are more likely than Canadians to say, yes, my company does, right? Whether there's really a performance difference between Canadian and American companies is we can only speculate, or look to other data. But in the opinions of employees, Americans are a little more attached to their employers. But the Canadian numbers are still very, very strong, stronger than we expect.
Yeah, exactly. Let's take a look at some of the sectors out there in the economy. Some of the leading sectors. When it came to managing COVID well, or the perception of managing COVID well, was the IT and the tech sector. Why would that be?
Well, I think some sectors, of course, they became more critical during the pandemic, right? And employers also were able to shift more easily, perhaps, to remote work environments, right? So you look at the number one sector, the sector in which Canadian workers were most likely to say, my employer has done a really good job. Number one, IT and communications, right? Finance and insurance did really well, as we expected, right? But interestingly, that better than finance and insurance was manufacturing, right? And manufacturing, not that easy to do in a remote work environment for obvious reasons. And so what that says to us is, it's not just about, obviously it was easier to manage the pandemic when you didn't have physical safety risks, right? The high satisfaction of manufacturing workers and surprisingly retail workers, maybe there was a dynamic there that, when there was shared adversity and employers had to adapt work environments to accommodate safety protocols, keep their employees safe. Employers who did that well, they're getting the benefit from their employees in the esteem of their employees now, right? So it's kind of that, shared adversity can sometimes create a stronger bond, and maybe that's what we're seeing in manufacturing and in retail. We don't see that everywhere, though. Accommodation, food services, warehousing, those sectors underperformed relative to the average, for example.
That's what I was going to ask you about, the lagging sectors. Now I can understand the accommodation and the retail area because and restaurants because those were obviously the hardest hit really when it came to the pandemic. But what surprised me was transportation and warehousing.
Yeah.
Why would that be lower?
Yeah, well, again, we can only speculate, but I think a lot of it comes down to the employee experience and and the communication of the employer with the employee, right? And how hard the employer worked in their words and in their actions to keep people safe and communicate with them. And I think what this suggests is that a sector like warehousing or transportation, that at least based on these numbers, maybe they weren't as effective in showing workers, hey, we're looking after you, and part of it too is we saw a lot of news during the pandemic about workers in warehouses getting COVID, right? And so
Yeah.
maybe this is saying, well, workers are agreeing that there was some of it could just be bad luck, but some of it's probably also just the extent to which the industry performed well and communicated well. Other quick thing I'll say is, looking at some of the other data, which I'm sure you want to talk about as well. You look at the overall employer-employee relationship. In some sectors, clearly, or some employers do better than others at actually listening to their employees and then acting on what you've heard, right? And that could be a factor here as well.
Yeah, let's follow up on that, Daniel, about the important. It's always important, right, to build a relationship with your staff and to engage your staff. But maybe during these types of crises and challenging times, is it even more important for companies to invest in those areas?
Absolutely. I mean, measuring relationships, understanding relationships, investing in relationships, it becomes way more important during a crisis. It's important all the time, of course. But, like if you think about a relationship, it's bi-directional, right? You can control it, but you can't influence it, right? And there's a rational side and there's an emotional side, right? Rationally, do I think you're competent and doing the right things to keep me safe, right? Emotionally, do we have shared values, empathy, affinity, trust, and can I influence you, right? And it's interesting that we looked at all the dimensions of relationship, and employers are doing pretty well in most of them, right? Employees tell us they're satisfied with their employer, 72%, right? 71% say my employer takes care of people who work here. 70% say I trust my employer, right? It's the same thing, Is my employer committed to meet my expectations? 65%. Concerned about people like me, 61%. But then you ask, can you influence your employer's decisions? Only 44%. But yet, isn't that the easiest one to change if you're an employer? Like, communicate with your employees, be transparent about your challenges, and engage them in helping you find solutions. And I think companies that were really transparent last year, for instance, let's say companies had to layoffs, right? Well, if the layoff comes like a bolt of lightning and no one understands why, they're not going to think very well of you, right? Whether you were left standing or shown the door. But if the company said, look, here are the numbers, here's what we're dealing with, and here's how we're going to show you, we're going to try to be generous and fair with people. Here's how we're going to reintegrate people, if business improves. Like that sort of transparency, I think there's no question in my mind that it helps the relationship, right?
I've been at this for a long time, right? I've been working for 40 years of my life for different companies and entities. I've covered a lot of business over the years, over the last 20 years. Quite frankly and personally, I just don't get it when companies don't get it about how important building relationships and engaging staff is. Like, I just, what is the stumbling block to that for companies?
Well, I think sometimes there's a feeling that, if I'm too transparent with them, especially during a crisis, I might scare them. Like they might not think where their job is safe or whatever, right? Sometimes there may be reluctance to ask employees for, hey, what do you think we should do? Because it might suggest weakness or might create pressure then to do what they ask you to do. But I think, most employers, I think, who go through that process in a way that's thoughtful, early on, you can say, well, we can't make all the changes. We can't do everything you want, but we want to understand what you want, to understand what's important to you. And then if you make changes as a result of that input, go back to them and say, here's how influential you really were. Like, I actually believe that employees are much more influential on their employers than they think they are. And there's kind of a tragedy there, because what it really means is the employer is thinking, right, about what their employees need or the advice of their employees, but they're not telling them, right,
Yeah.
about the influence they had, right? And it's interesting. I looked just, in preparation for our discussion today, I looked at Alberta specifically. And Alberta employees give their employers higher scores on management of COVID. It go 83%. So it's actually higher in Alberta,
Wow.
but slightly lower scores on the different dimensions of relationship. And can I influence my employer? Only 32%. So much lower, right? It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Like,
It is.
so there's a bit of a duality there. Like, they felt, so that says to me, well, I feel my employer is really competent, but I really want my employer to engage me more. And I think that's a really interesting takeaway for Calgary business leaders.
Yeah. And I think just one last thing, Daniel, I just think whenever you're talking about relationships or communication, or the fact that, 77% of Canadians agree that they're managed COVID well, it's all about ending up having employees who are content, happy, obviously more productive, right?
Yeah, absolutely it does. And that is so critical right now, because we're seeing it right across the economy right now, right? People have been stuck, for a year, working in stressful, if you're frontline workers and still going to a physical work environment, life has been pretty stressful, right? You're wearing masks, face shields and
Yeah.
partitions, and worried about, getting sick, right? If you're remote, you got no boundaries between your work life and your home life. You're dealing with kids maybe, or family, or bad internet access, and no separation between your work and your home, which is really stressful, right? So what's going to happen this year? We're going to see a lot of people looking for new jobs, right? We're already seeing that, right? It's inevitable. And so I believe that those companies that have invested in these essential relationships, they'll still see turnover, but they'll be better positioned, for renewed growth in the recovery.
All right, super. Thanks very much, Daniel, for joining us today.
My pleasure, Mario. Best of luck, and look forward to talking again.
All right, super. That was Daniel Tisch, who is CEO of Argyle. This has been Business Insider with Mario Toneguzzi on YYC Business. Thanks for joining us today.